The assembly hall in the village of Hartwell glowed with the warm light of dozens of candles on that late September afternoon in 1815, their flames dancing against the polished wood panels as if celebrating the golden autumn that had settled over Devon like a blessing. Eleanor Ashworth stood near the tall windows, her dove-grey gown modest among the brighter silks of the other ladies. Yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity that 8 years of hardship had forged into something unshakable. She had learned to find joy in small pleasures now, in the country dances she no longer participated in, but watched with genuine appreciation, in the music that filled the room with its cheerful melodies, in the simple knowledge that Tommy was safe at home with Charlotte, likely begging for one more story before bed. The assembly was a modest affair by London standards, yet it was the heartbeat of their small community, and Eleanor had allowed herself to be persuaded by Charlotte to attend, to remember that she was still a woman of 28, with years stretching before her, not merely a mother and music teacher defined solely by her responsibilities. She smiled as old Mrs. Pemberton's granddaughter stumbled through a quadrille, remembering her own clumsy first dances in another lifetime, in another world entirely. The room hummed with conversation and laughter, the comfortable sounds of neighbours who had known each other for generations, and Eleanor felt the tension she carried in her shoulders begin to ease as she accepted a cup of lemonade from a passing servant. It was precisely in that moment of unguarded contentment that the doors to the assembly hall opened and the temperature of the room seemed to shift, conversations faltering as heads turned toward the entrance. Baron Westbrook entered first, his jovial face flushed with the pleasure of showing off his distinguished houseguest. But Eleanor did not see him at all, because her eyes had found the man who followed, and the lemonade cup nearly slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers. Frederick Sinclair, Duke of Ravenscroft, stood framed in the doorway, his tall figure immaculate in evening dress, his dark hair touched with premature silver at the temples, and those eyes, those distinctive silver-grey eyes that she saw every single day in her son's face, scanning the room with an expression of barely concealed boredom. 8 years vanished in a heartbeat as terror seized her chest with iron fingers, and she could not breathe, could not move, could not do anything but stare at the ghost of her past made suddenly, devastatingly flesh. He had aged, she noticed with the strange clarity of shock, lines bracketing his mouth that spoke of years without laughter. And then his restless gaze swept across the assembly and found her, and the boredom in his expression shattered into something raw and disbelieving. For one eternal moment they stood frozen, connected across the crowded room by the invisible thread of everything that had passed between them, and Eleanor saw his lips form her name, though no sound reached her ears. She ran. She did not think, did not plan, simply gathered her skirts and fled through the servants' entrance, through the kitchen where startled maids pressed against walls, out into the cool September evening where she gasped for air like a drowning woman. Behind her, she heard the commotion of pursuit, heard Baron Westbrook's confused protests, and Frederick's voice cutting through them with aristocratic command. And she ran faster, her sensible shoes pounding against cobblestones as she disappeared into the gathering dusk. Frederick Sinclair stood in the doorway she had fled through, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on the shadows that had swallowed her, and for the first time in 8 years, the cynical mask he wore cracked to reveal the desperate young man who had never stopped searching for the woman who had vanished from his life without a word of farewell. The ballroom blazed with the light of 1,000 candles on that sweltering July evening in 1807. Their flames reflected in the tall mirrors that lined the walls of Lord Hartington's London townhouse until the entire room seemed to shimmer like something from a fever dream. Eleanor stood at the edge of the dance floor in her white muslin gown with its modest blue ribbons, acutely aware that her dress was last season's fashion and that her mother's pearl earrings were the only jewelry she possessed. Yet she held her chin high because her father had taught her that dignity cost nothing and was worth everything. She was 20 years old, and this was only her second London season, funded by the careful scrimping of years and the desperate hope that she might make a match that would save her family from the genteel poverty that threatened to swallow them whole. Her father stood somewhere in the card room, she knew, losing money they did not have in a futile attempt to win back what he had already lost. And her mother had died 3 years ago, never knowing how bad things had truly become. Eleanor tried not to think of the unpaid bills hidden in her father's study, tried instead to focus on the music and the swirling colors of the dancers, and it was in that moment of determined optimism that she felt someone watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. She turned and found herself caught in a gaze of the most extraordinary silver grey, eyes that seemed to see past her plain dress and modest circumstances to something within her that she had not known existed. The gentleman was tall and dark-haired, perhaps 26 years of age, and he moved toward her through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone who had never been denied anything in his life. Frederick Sinclair, the Duke of Ravenscroft. She heard someone whisper as he passed, and Eleanor's heart began to pound, because surely he was not approaching her. Surely there was some diamond of the first water, standing just behind her shoulder. But he stopped before her and bowed with perfect elegance, and when he asked her to dance, his voice was low and warm and contained none of the aristocratic boredom she had expected. They danced, and the world fell away, the heat of the summer night pressing close as they moved through the figures of the country dance. And he asked her questions about her life, her interests, her opinions on everything from poetry to politics, as if her answers genuinely mattered to him. Eleanor found herself laughing, speaking freely, forgetting to guard herself against hope. And when the dance ended, he led her to the refreshment table and stayed by her side for another hour, oblivious to the whispers spreading through the ballroom. Across the crowded room, a woman watched them with cold blue eyes above a magnificent sapphire necklace, her thin lips pressed together in a line of pure displeasure. Lady Agatha Sinclair, Dowager Duchess of Ravenscroft, had plans for her son that did not include a penniless nobody with nothing to recommend her but a pretty face and an inappropriate amount of spirit. And as she watched Frederick smile at the girl in the white muslin gown, she began to calculate exactly how to destroy this inconvenient attachment before it could take root. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The garden at Lord Pembroke's estate lay drenched in moonlight on that warm August evening in 1807, the scent of late summer roses hanging heavy in the air as Eleanor slipped through the terrace doors and into the silver-shadowed world beyond, her heart pounding with the delicious terror of knowing Frederick would be waiting for her among the hedgerows. 3 weeks had passed since that first dance in London, 3 weeks of stolen glances and whispered conversations and a correspondence so frequent that her father had begun to notice the expensive paper that arrived daily bearing the Ravenscroft seal, and Eleanor had fallen so deeply in love that she could no longer remember what her life had felt like before those silver-grey eyes had found her across a crowded ballroom. She found him beside the fountain where they had agreed to meet, his tall figure silhouetted against the moonlit spray, and when he turned at the sound of her footsteps, his face transformed with a joy so unguarded that her breath caught in her throat. He reached for her hands and drew her close, closer than propriety allowed, and Eleanor did not pull away because propriety seemed a distant and irrelevant thing when measured against the warmth of his fingers intertwined with hers. "I spoke with my solicitor yesterday," he murmured, his voice low and urgent in the fragrant darkness, "and I intend to call upon your father when we return to London next week, if you will permit me, if you will have me, Eleanor." She could not speak, could only nod as happy tears spilled down her cheeks, and then his hands were cupping her face, and his lips were pressing against hers in a kiss that tasted of promises and moonlight, and a future she had never dared to imagine. The world fell away as she surrendered to his embrace, her fingers finding the signet ring on his hand and tracing its familiar crest as he whispered words of love against her hair, spoke of the home they would build together, the children they would raise, the lifetime stretching before them like an unwritten story waiting to be told. She believed him with every fibre of her being, because his voice held no artifice, his eyes no deception, only the same overwhelming love that consumed her own heart like a flame. Behind them, invisible in the shadows of the terrace, Lady Agatha Sinclair stood watching with cold fury in her eyes, her sapphire necklace glinting like ice in the moonlight as she observed her son embracing the unsuitable nobody who threatened to destroy all her carefully laid plans for his future. The Dowager Duchess had not risen to her position by accepting defeat gracefully, and as she watched Eleanor lean into Frederick's kiss with trusting abandon, she began to formulate the scheme that would separate them forever. But Frederick and Eleanor knew nothing of the danger lurking in the darkness behind them, knew only the sweetness of this moment, the rightness of being in each other's arms, and when they finally parted with whispered promises to meet again tomorrow, neither could have imagined that their fragile happiness had already been marked for destruction by the woman who watched them with calculating eyes and a heart as cold as the stones she wore around her throat. The morning of September 15th, 1807, dawned grey and cold, a fitting mirror for the devastation that awaited Eleanor in her father's study, where she had been summoned with unusual formality by a servant whose eyes would not meet her own. She had woken that morning with a secret burning in her chest, a secret she had only confirmed the day before when the local midwife had examined her with knowing hands and pronounced what Eleanor had already suspected for weeks, that she was carrying Frederick's child, and she had spent the night alternating between terror and wild joy, because surely this would only hasten their wedding. Surely Frederick would be overjoyed to know that their love had already borne fruit. But when she entered the study, she found not her father alone, but a woman seated in the best chair by the cold fireplace, a woman whose sapphire necklace caught the weak morning light, and whose cold blue eyes regarded Eleanor with the triumphant disdain of a general surveying a conquered enemy. Lady Agatha Sinclair did not rise or offer any greeting, merely gestured with one elegant hand for Eleanor to sit, and Eleanor's father stood by the window, with his back turned, his shoulders hunched in a posture of such profound shame that Eleanor's blood turned to ice in her veins before a single word had been spoken. "My son will not be marrying you," Lady Agatha said without preamble, her voice as cold and precise as a surgical instrument, and Eleanor felt the words strike her like physical blows even as she shook her head in desperate denial. "He asked me," she whispered. "He promised. We are to be engaged." But Lady Agatha's laugh was a brittle, cruel thing that shattered Eleanor's protests before they could fully form. "My dear, foolish girl," the Dowager Duchess continued, "did you really believe a duke would marry a penniless nobody whose father cannot even pay his gambling debts? Frederick was merely amusing himself, as young men do, and now he has grown bored and moved on to more suitable prospects." Eleanor turned to her father with pleading eyes, but he would not look at her, would not turn from the window, and Lady Agatha produced a document and a small purse that clinked with coins as she set them on the desk between them. "Your father has agreed to send you to your cousin in Devon," she said, "and in exchange I have settled his most pressing debts and provided £500 for your maintenance, though I see from the accounts that only £50 will actually reach your hands, the rest being required to satisfy your father's creditors." Eleanor wanted to scream that she was carrying Frederick's child, wanted to demand that someone fetch him so she could hear these lies from his own lips, but Lady Agatha seemed to read her thoughts and smiled with cold satisfaction. "If you attempt to contact my son," she said, rising to leave, "I will ensure that you and your father are utterly destroyed, and any letters you send will never reach him. I have seen to that." Eleanor watched her father sign the document with trembling hands, watched her future crumble to dust, and when Lady Agatha swept from the room, Eleanor sank to her knees on the cold floor and wept for the man she had loved, the man who had apparently never loved her at all, and for the child growing inside her who would never know its father. The morning light that crept through the curtains of Eleanor's modest cottage found her already awake, though awake suggested she had slept at all, which she had not, for she had spent the long hours since fleeing the assembly. Pacing the worn floorboards of her bedroom with her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for escape. 8 years she had built this life, brick by careful brick, constructing a wall of respectability around herself and Tommy that had seemed impenetrable until the moment those silver-grey eyes had found her across the crowded assembly hall and shattered every illusion of safety she had so painstakingly created. She pressed her trembling hands against the cool glass of the window and stared out at the quiet lane beyond the blue-painted door, half expecting to see Frederick's tall figure striding toward her with accusations on his lips and fury in his gaze. But the lane remained empty, save for a tabby cat washing itself in a patch of early sunlight. Behind her, she heard the creak of small feet on the stairs and turned to find Tommy standing in the doorway in his nightshirt, his dark hair tousled from sleep, and his grey eyes, those damning grey eyes that were the exact shade of his father's, watching her with the worried intensity that no 7-year-old should possess. "Mama, are you unwell?" he asked, padding across the room to take her hand in his small, warm fingers. "You look as though you have been crying." And Eleanor forced a smile onto her face even as her heart broke at his concern. This child, who had never known his father, who believed the story she had carefully constructed about a husband who had died before his birth, who had no idea that the very eyes he looked through were a mirror of the man who had appeared like a ghost from her past. "I am perfectly well, my darling," she lied, smoothing his hair with fingers that still trembled, merely tired from the assembly, and Tommy accepted this explanation with the trusting faith of childhood before announcing that he was hungry and racing downstairs to the kitchen. Eleanor was still standing frozen by the window when Charlotte Fairfax arrived an hour later, her red hair escaping its pins as usual, and her round face flushed from her hurried walk across the lane. And one look at Eleanor's pale countenance told her friend everything she needed to know. "You saw him," Charlotte said without preamble. "The Duke. He was at the assembly. I heard whispers this morning at the bakery," and Eleanor could only nod as Charlotte guided her to a chair and pressed a cup of tea into her shaking hands. She listened as Eleanor poured out the story of last night, of their eyes meeting, of her panicked flight. And when Eleanor spoke of packing their things and fleeing to another village, another county, anywhere Frederick could not find them, Charlotte gripped her hands firmly and shook her head. "You cannot run forever," she said with the practical wisdom that had sustained their friendship through so many difficult years. "Tommy has his lessons here, his friends, his life, and you have built something real in this village, something worth protecting. So instead of running, you must stand your ground and face whatever comes." Eleanor looked toward the parlor where her piano stood waiting for her students, the instrument that had been her salvation, and she thought of Tommy laughing with the village children, of the cottage with its blue door that had become their home. And she knew Charlotte was right, even as terror wrapped its cold fingers around her heart. The knock upon the blue door came at precisely 2:30 in the afternoon, and Eleanor had been expecting it with the same grim certainty with which one awaits a storm that has been gathering on the horizon all morning. So, when she opened the door to find Frederick standing there in his riding clothes, his jaw set in a hard line and his silver-grey eyes blazing with 8 years of bottled fury, she merely stepped aside and gestured him into the modest parlor where her piano stood against one wall and Tommy's toy soldier kept its silent vigil upon the windowsill. He did not wait for pleasantries, did not acknowledge the humble surroundings that must have seemed so far beneath the grandeur he inhabited, but turned upon her the moment the door closed and spoke in a voice that trembled with barely contained rage. "You took the money and you laughed," he said, his hands clenched at his sides as though he did not trust himself to keep them still. "My mother told me everything, how you accepted £500 to disappear from my life, how you mocked my intention to propose, how you said a duke's bastard would have been useful, but a duke's wife was never your ambition." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as she listened to these monstrous lies, these poisonous fabrications that bore no resemblance to the devastation she had actually suffered. And for a moment she could not speak at all. could only stare at this man she had once loved with every fibre of her being, and wonder how he could possibly believe such cruelty of her. £500? She repeated slowly, her voice emerging as a whisper before strengthening with indignation. I received £50, sir, barely enough to survive upon, and I was told that you had grown bored of your country amusement and had no intention of marrying so far beneath your station that any attempt to contact you would result in my utter ruin. They stood facing each other across the small parlour, the air between them crackling with accusation and confusion, and Eleanor watched as something shifted in Frederick's expression, a crack appearing in the edifice of his certainty as her words penetrated the narrative he had believed for nearly a decade. Someone is lying, he said slowly, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to turn away. And I am beginning to suspect it was neither of us. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, as though she could hold together the fragments of her composure, and she was so focused upon Frederick's face, upon the dawning realization she saw there, that she did not notice his gaze drift toward the windowsill, where Tommy's toy soldier stood at attention, nor did she see the way his brow furrowed as he took in the small boots by the door, the child's slate upon the table, the evidence of a young life woven throughout every corner of her home. You have a child, he said, and the question in his voice made Eleanor's heart stop beating entirely in her chest. The front door of the cottage burst open before Eleanor could formulate a response to Frederick's question about the child, and Tommy came tumbling through in a whirlwind of autumn leaves and boyish energy, his dark hair wind-swept and his cheeks flushed from running, clutching his beloved toy soldier in one small fist as he called out, "Mama, I finished my lessons early, and Mr. Pemberton said I might come home," and then he stopped short in the middle of the parlour, his grey eyes widening as he took in the tall stranger standing rigid beside the fireplace. And in that frozen moment, Eleanor watched her carefully constructed world begin to crack and splinter like ice beneath a heavy boot. Tommy's gaze travelled from the stranger's polished boots up past his expensive riding coat to his face, and Eleanor saw the precise instant when her son's expression shifted from simple curiosity to something deeper, something that made her heart clench with a terror she had never known before. For Tommy was studying Frederick with the intense concentration he usually reserved for his collection of rocks and feathers, cataloguing details, comparing, calculating, in that quick, clever way of his that reminded her so painfully of the man standing before them. Frederick had gone utterly still, his face draining of colour as he stared at this small mirror of himself, at the dark hair that fell across the boy's forehead, in the same stubborn wave that Frederick's own hair displayed, at the set of his jaw and the shape of his brows, but most of all at those eyes, those distinctive silver-grey eyes that marked every Sinclair as surely as a brand. "Mama," Tommy said slowly, his voice carrying the puzzled quality of a child attempting to work out a particularly difficult sum. "Why does that man have my eyes?" And the crystal glass that Frederick had been holding slipped from his nerveless fingers and shattered upon the floor, sending shards scattering across the worn wooden boards like a constellation of broken stars, and the sound seemed to break the spell that had held all three of them frozen in place. Eleanor moved instinctively, stepping between Frederick and her son with her arms outstretched in a gesture of protection that was as ancient as motherhood itself, her body positioning itself as a shield against whatever storm was about to break. But Frederick was not looking at her, could not seem to tear his gaze away from Tommy, and Eleanor watched as 8 years of lies and lost time crashed down upon him in a single devastating wave of understanding. "He is mine," Frederick whispered, the words emerging as though torn from some deep wounded place within him, his voice cracking on the simple syllables. And Tommy looked between the two adults with growing confusion, his small hand tightening on the toy soldier as he sensed the terrible currents of emotion swirling through the room, and Eleanor could only nod once, her throat too constricted to speak, as the afternoon light streaming through the window illuminated the undeniable truth written in the matching features of father and son. The evening had drawn in around the cottage like a shroud by the time Eleanor returned from walking Tommy to Charlotte's door, and she found Frederick exactly where she had left him, standing before the cold fireplace with his back rigid and his hands clasped behind him in the posture of a man holding himself together through sheer force of will. And when she entered the parlor, he did not turn immediately, but spoke to the empty grate in a voice that was raw with something she had never heard from him before, something that sounded terrifyingly like grief. "You let me believe he was dead," he said. And Eleanor felt the accusation land like a physical blow, even as she moved to light the candles against the encroaching darkness, her hands trembling slightly as she touched flame to wick and watched the soft golden light bloom across the worn furnishings of her modest home. "I believed you were dead to us," she replied quietly, settling into the chair beside the fireplace while Frederick remained standing, a towering figure of barely contained emotion in his expensive riding clothes that looked so utterly out of place amid her humble possessions, and she continued before he could interrupt, "I believed you had used me and discarded me, that your promises in Lord Pembroke's garden were nothing but pretty lies designed to seduce a foolish girl who should have known better than to trust a duke." Frederick finally turned to face her, and Eleanor saw that his silver-grey eyes, so like Tommy's that it made her chest ache, were bright with unshed tears that he seemed determined not to allow to fall, and when he spoke his voice cracked on the words like ice breaking under too much weight. "My mother told me you took £500 and laughed at my intention to propose," he said. "She told me you had boasted to your friends that you had played the young duke for a fool and extracted a fortune for your troubles, and I believed her because I could not fathom that my own mother would construct such an elaborate cruelty." Eleanor felt something shift in her understanding as she absorbed this revelation, the pieces of an 8-year-old puzzle finally beginning to arrange themselves into a picture she had never imagined, and she shook her head slowly as the full scope of Lady Agatha's machinations began to dawn upon her exhausted mind. "I received £50, she said, her voice steadier now as righteous anger began to replace the fear that had gripped her all day, "and I was told that you had tired of your country amusement and wished never to hear my name again, that any attempt to contact you would result in my complete ruin and my father's imprisonment for his debts. And so I went to Devon, with my heart shattered and my body carrying your child, and I built a life from nothing because I believed you had abandoned us both." The candles flickered in a draught from the window, casting dancing shadows across Frederick's face as he absorbed her words. And Eleanor watched the transformation occur, watched the anger drain away to be replaced by something far more devastating, a grief so profound that it seemed to age him years, in mere moments, and when he finally sank into the chair opposite hers, his head falling into his hands, she understood that they had both been victims of a cruelty neither of them had ever suspected. The morning arrived wrapped in the pale gold of autumn sunlight, and Eleanor stood at her kitchen window watching Frederick's tall figure approach along the lane, his expensive coat looking somehow less imposing than it had the day before, his stride carrying a hesitation she had never witnessed in him during those long-ago summer days when he had moved through the world with the easy confidence of a man who had never known doubt or denial, and she felt her heart perform a complicated maneuver somewhere between dread and something dangerously close to hope, as she dried her hands on her apron and prepared to admit him to her home once more. Tommy had been vibrating with curiosity since waking, peppering her with questions about the mysterious gentleman who had visited yesterday, the one with eyes like his own, the one whose presence had made his mother's face go pale as winter frost, and Eleanor had answered as carefully as she could, explaining only that this was an old friend who wished to know him better, a response that had satisfied the boy's immediate curiosity while leaving so much unsaid that the words felt like stones in her throat. Frederick entered the cottage with a formal bow that seemed almost absurd given the revelations of the previous evening, and Eleanor watched as his silver-grey gaze immediately sought out Tommy, who stood beside the hearth clutching his toy soldier with an expression of solemn assessment that reminded her so powerfully of Frederick examining parliamentary documents that she nearly laughed despite the gravity of the moment. "I understand you have a collection of treasures," Frederick said, his voice carefully gentle in a way that spoke of a man handling something infinitely precious and terrifyingly fragile. And Tommy's small face transformed with delight as he seized the opportunity to share his greatest passion with this fascinating stranger. The next hour passed in a blur of wonder and heartbreak as Eleanor watched her son lead his father through the modest garden behind the cottage, pointing out the special rocks he had gathered from the stream, the feathers he had collected from various birds, the particular corner where he had once seen a hedgehog curl into a ball, and Frederick listened to every word with an intensity of attention that made Tommy practically glow with importance. Frederick produced his pocket watch at one point, a magnificent piece of gold and crystal that caught the morning light like captured sunshine, and Tommy's eyes went wide as he was permitted to hold it, to hear it tick, to feel the weight of something so fine in his small hands. And Eleanor saw Frederick's jaw tighten with emotion as he watched his son examine the timepiece with such careful reverence. "You have his curiosity," Frederick said quietly when Tommy ran ahead to show them where the best blackberries grew in summer, and Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the thickness in her throat, watching as 8 years of absence began to knit themselves together in the golden morning light, watching as her son gained a father and her heart cracked open to feelings she had thought safely buried in the past, and she knew with sudden certainty that nothing would ever be simple again. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lane behind Eleanor's cottage as she walked beside Frederick, their steps falling into an unconscious rhythm while Tommy's laughter drifted to them from the garden where he chased butterflies with the boundless energy of a child who had discovered that the world contained more joy than he had previously imagined. And Eleanor found herself stealing glances at the man beside her, this stranger who had once been everything to her, and who now occupied a space in her life that she could not yet define. "Tell me exactly what happened that morning," Frederick said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man preparing to hear truths that would wound him deeply. And Eleanor drew a breath of autumn air scented with fallen leaves and wood smoke before she began to unspool the memories she had kept locked away for 8 years. "Your mother came to our lodgings at dawn," she said, watching a copper leaf spiral down to rest upon the path before them. "And she told my father that you had grown bored with your country diversion and wished to be rid of me without scandal, that any attempt on my part to contact you would result in my complete ruin and his imprisonment for the debts he owed to various creditors who had grown impatient with his promises." Frederick's jaw tightened as he listened, and Eleanor continued, her voice steady, despite the pain of remembering that terrible morning when her world had shattered into fragments she had spent years piecing back together. "She gave my father £50, Eleanor said, "not the 500 you were told, barely enough to send me to my cousin in Devon and keep us fed for a few months. And when I asked to write to you, to hear your rejection from your own hand, she laughed and said you had already departed for a house party in Scotland and would not welcome correspondence from a girl who had so thoroughly misunderstood the nature of your attentions." Frederick stopped walking abruptly, his hands clenching at his sides as his silver-grey eyes blazed with a fury that Eleanor understood was not directed at her, but at the woman who had orchestrated their mutual destruction with such calculated precision. "I searched for you for 6 months, he said through gritted teeth. "I hired investigators. I questioned everyone who might have known where you had gone, but my mother had covered her tracks thoroughly, and everyone I asked seemed to believe you had simply returned to the countryside from whence you came, and eventually I was told you had died of a fever, a lie I now realize my mother must have planted to end my searching." Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest as she absorbed this revelation, the knowledge that he had looked for her, that he had not simply moved on to other amusements as she had been led to believe. And when Tommy's laughter rose again from the garden, she turned to look at Frederick and saw tears tracking silently down his aristocratic cheeks. "We have both been robbed," she whispered, and Frederick nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the small boy who represented everything his mother had stolen from them. And when he spoke again, his voice held a cold determination that made Eleanor shiver. "I will confront her," he said, and she will answer for every moment of suffering she has caused. The cold grandeur of Ravenscroft House rose before Frederick like a monument to everything he had once believed about duty and family, and the sacred bonds between mother and son. And as his carriage rolled to a stop before the imposing marble steps, he felt none of the homecoming warmth that should accompany a return to one's ancestral seat, only the ice-cold fury that had sustained him through 3 days of hard travel from Devon, through sleepless nights spent cataloguing every lie his mother had told him, every year she had stolen from him, every moment of his son's life that he would never recover. The footman bowed as he swept through the entrance hall, past the portraits of Sinclair ancestors, who gazed down with the same silver-grey eyes that Tommy had inherited, and Frederick climbed the grand staircase, with steps that echoed like drumbeats of approaching judgment, his mind fixed upon the woman who waited in her private sitting-room where she always took her afternoon tea at precisely 4 o'clock, a creature of habit and rigid propriety who had destroyed 2 lives in service of her precious family legacy. Lady Agatha looked up from her embroidery as he entered without knocking, her sapphire necklace catching the pale November light that filtered through tall windows, and for a moment Frederick saw a flicker of something like fear cross her aristocratic features before she composed herself into the mask of maternal dignity she had worn his entire life. "Frederick," she said with careful pleasantness, "I did not expect you back from the country so soon," and he watched her hands continue their needlework with only the slightest tremor betraying her unease as he remained standing, refusing the seat she gestured toward, refusing to pretend this was anything other than what it was. "I found her," he said, and the words fell into the elegant room like stones into still water. "And I found my son, the child you told me did not exist, the boy who has lived for 7 years believing his father was dead, while I believed his mother had betrayed me and laughed at my proposal of marriage." Lady Agatha's needle stilled at last, and when she raised her cold blue eyes to meet his gaze, Frederick saw not remorse, but calculation, the swift assessment of a woman determining how best to defend her position, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same dismissive certainty with which she had always pronounced judgment upon those she deemed beneath the Sinclair name. "I did what any mother would do to protect her son from a scheming fortune hunter," she said, setting aside her embroidery with deliberate calm. "That girl was nobody, Frederick, a gentleman's daughter of no consequence, with a father drowning in debt, and you were so besotted you could not see that she would have ruined everything our family has built over generations. You paid her father £50, Frederick said through gritted teeth. "Not the 500 you claimed. You sent her away carrying my child, while telling me she had accepted a fortune and mocked my affections. You let me believe she was dead, mother. You let me grieve for a woman who was alive and struggling while I lived in luxury and emptiness." Lady Agatha rose from her chair with the rigid dignity of a woman who had never apologized for anything in her life, and Frederick saw in that moment how completely she believed in her own righteousness, how thoroughly convinced she remained that bloodlines and fortunes mattered more than love or truth or the bonds between fathers and sons. "You will remove yourself to the Dower House by week's end," he said quietly, "and you will remain there until I determine whether I can ever bear to look upon your face again." The sound of carriage wheels upon the muddy lane reached Eleanor's ears before she saw the elegant vehicle emerge through the grey November mist, and she felt her heart constrict with a complicated mixture of anticipation and dread as she recognized the Ravenscroft crest upon the door, for it had been 1 week since Frederick had departed for London with cold fury burning in his silver-grey eyes, and she had spent each of those 7 days wondering whether he would return at all, or whether the confrontation with his mother had somehow changed his determination to know his son. But now here he was, stepping down from the carriage with a large package tucked beneath his arm and a smaller box in his hand, and Tommy came racing from the garden where he had been helping Charlotte gather the last of the autumn vegetables, his small face alight with a joy that made Eleanor's chest ache with the knowledge that her son had already given his heart to this man who had been a stranger mere weeks ago, He came back," Tommy shouted as he hurtled toward Frederick with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of childhood, and Eleanor watched as Frederick knelt in the mud without regard for his expensive traveling clothes to catch the boy in an embrace that spoke of all the years he had lost, all the moments he had missed, all the love that had been denied him by his mother's cruel machinations. And when he rose and met Eleanor's gaze over Tommy's dark head, she saw something fierce and determined in his expression that made her wrap her shawl more tightly around her shoulders as if it could protect her from whatever was to come. The gifts were presented with ceremony in the small parlor, a set of tin soldiers for Tommy that sent the boy into raptures of delight, and a length of fine blue wool for Eleanor that she tried to refuse, but Frederick insisted was merely practical given the approaching winter. And then Charlotte appeared with convenient timing to suggest she take Tommy to her cottage to arrange his new soldiers in proper military formation. And Eleanor understood that Frederick had arranged this moment of privacy with the same careful planning he likely applied to matters of his vast estate. "I have thought of nothing but you and Thomas for 7 days," Frederick said when they were alone, standing before the fireplace where a modest fire crackled against the November chill. "And I have come to realize that there is only one proper course of action that will give our son the life he deserves, the name he should rightfully bear, the inheritance that is his birthright as my firstborn child. And so I am asking you, Eleanor, to become my wife, to become the Duchess of Ravenscroft, to take your place beside me, and give Thomas the legitimacy that my mother's cruelty denied him." Eleanor felt the weight of his words settle upon her like a physical thing. This proposal she had once dreamed of hearing spoken in moonlit gardens, with love shining in his eyes, now delivered in her modest parlor with duty and obligation where passion should have been, and when she looked at Frederick's handsome face, she saw the man she had loved 8 years ago, hidden beneath layers of pain and betrayal and carefully constructed walls, and she knew that accepting this proposal would give Tommy everything she had ever wanted for him, while potentially condemning herself to a marriage built on the ashes of what might have been, rather than the living fire of what could still become. "I need time," she whispered, and Frederick nodded once, his jaw tight, but his eyes showing the first flicker of something that might have been hope. The fortnight that followed Frederick's proposal unfolded like the slow turning of autumn leaves from gold to copper to the deep russet of late October, and Eleanor found herself marking time not by the calendar, but by the daily appearance of Frederick's tall figure at her garden gate, by the sound of Tommy's delighted shouts when he spotted his father's horse coming down the lane, by the gradual softening of something that had been frozen inside her chest for 8 long years. Frederick had taken lodgings at the Rose and Crown Inn in Hartwell, a modest establishment that had never housed a duke in all its 200 years of existence. And the innkeeper's wife could not stop telling anyone who would listen about his Grace's particular requirements for his morning coffee and his evening brandy, about the letters he sent daily to London, about the way he rose each morning at dawn to ride out, toward the cottage with the blue door where the widowed music teacher lived with her grey-eyed son. The village gossip swirled like fallen leaves in an autumn wind, but Eleanor found she cared less about the whispers with each passing day, for she was too busy watching Frederick learn to be a father, watching him kneel in the mud to examine the interesting beetle Tommy had discovered, watching him lift the boy onto his great black horse and walk slowly around the paddock, with one hand steadying Tommy's small back, and such tender concentration on his aristocratic features that Eleanor sometimes had to turn away to hide the tears that pricked at her eyes. They walked together through the lanes, while Tommy ran ahead chasing rabbits and collecting the last blackberries from the hedgerows, and Frederick told her about his estates, about the tenants who depended on him, about the improvements he hoped to make, and Eleanor found herself sharing her own small dreams for Tommy's education, for the garden she hoped to expand come spring, for the music students she taught each afternoon, while Frederick entertained their son with stories of London and promises of ponies and adventures yet to come. One golden afternoon, when the October sun hung low and warm above the Devon hills, Tommy begged Frederick to teach him to skip stones across the pond behind Charlotte's cottage, and Eleanor sat on a fallen log watching them together, father and son with their matching dark hair and silver-grey eyes and stubborn chins. And she felt something crack open inside her chest that she had kept carefully sealed since that terrible morning 8 years ago when Lady Agatha had told her that Frederick Sinclair had never intended to make her his wife. He laughed when Tommy's stone sank immediately, and the sound of Frederick's laughter, so different from the cold formality he had shown during their first confrontations, made Eleanor remember summer gardens and whispered promises and the man she had loved before the world had taught her that love was a luxury she could not afford. And when Frederick looked up and caught her watching him, his smile softening into something more intimate, more questioning, more hopeful, Eleanor felt the walls around her heart begin to crumble, like ancient ruins giving way at last to spring. The rain began as a whisper against the window panes in late October, growing steadily throughout the afternoon, until by evening it had become a steady drumming that enclosed Eleanor's small cottage in a curtain of silver and shadow. And she found herself grateful for the storm because it had given her an excuse to invite Frederick to stay for supper, rather than ride back to the inn through such weather. And now Tommy slept upstairs in his narrow bed, with his new tin soldiers arranged in careful formation on the nightstand, while Eleanor and Frederick sat before the fire in her modest parlour, the flames casting dancing shadows across their faces, and the intimacy of the small room pressing around them like a living thing. She had poured tea that neither of them drank, had offered biscuits that sat untouched on the chipped plate, had made small conversation about Tommy's progress in his letters and the state of the roads, until finally a silence fell between them that felt different from the hostile silences of their first meetings, softer somehow, expectant, as if the storm outside had washed away the last pretenses and left only two people who had once loved each other and lost everything. "Tell me," Frederick said quietly, his silver-grey eyes reflecting the firelight as he leaned forward in the worn chair that had been her father's. "Tell me what these years have been for you." And Eleanor found herself speaking before she could think to guard her words, telling him about the journey to Devon with nothing but a small trunk and the terrifying knowledge of the child growing inside her, about her cousin Margaret, who had taken her in with pinched lips and constant reminders of Eleanor's fallen state, about the nights she had lain awake wondering how she would feed her baby when her small sum of money ran out, about the day 6 months after Tommy's birth when word came that her father had died alone in London with nothing but debts and an empty bottle beside him. She told Frederick about learning to teach piano to the daughters of local merchants, about the calluses she had developed on her fingers from practicing pieces she would never perform for pleasure, about the small victories of finding this cottage and making it a home, and watching Tommy grow strong and curious and kind, despite having no father to guide him. And as she spoke, she watched Frederick's face transform from polite attention to something rawer, more painful, his hands gripping the arms of the chair as if he needed to anchor himself against the weight of her words. "I did not know," he said when she finally fell silent, his voice rough with emotion. "I swear to you, Eleanor, I did not know any of this." And when he reached across the space between them to take her hand in his fingers warm and strong around hers, Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, like a key turning in a lock that had been frozen for 8 long years, and she did not pull away. The following evening found them once more in Eleanor's small parlour, with the fire burning low and the rain that had plagued Devon for 3 days, finally giving way to a clear autumn night that pressed dark and cold against the window panes. And Eleanor sat in her usual chair, with her hands folded in her lap, while Frederick stood before the mantelpiece, staring into the flames with an expression she had never seen him wear before, something raw and uncertain that stripped away the armour of his wealth and title and left only the man beneath, the man she had loved so desperately 8 years ago, before the world had taught them both such bitter lessons. "You shared your story last night," he said without turning to face her, his voice low and rough, as if the words cost him something to speak. "And I listened, and I felt such shame that I could barely breathe. But I did not tell you mine, and if we are to move forward from this place, then you deserve to know what these 8 years have been for me, for I would not have you think that I escaped unscathed while you suffered alone." He turned then, and Eleanor saw that his silver-grey eyes were bright with something that might have been unshed tears, and her breath caught in her throat because Frederick Sinclair, Duke of Ravenscroft, did not weep, had never wept, even as a boy, according to the stories she had heard whispered in London ballrooms, and yet here he stood before her, with his defences crumbling and his heart laid open like a wound. "I searched for you," he said, crossing the small room to sink into the chair across from hers with a weariness that seemed to age him a decade in an instant. "I searched for 6 months until my man of business finally found a trail that led to your cousin in Devon. But by then my mother had told me what you had supposedly said when you took her money, that you had laughed at my foolishness for believing a girl of your circumstances would actually marry a man like me. And I was too proud and too wounded to pursue you further, and so I let you go, and told myself I was better off without a woman who could betray me so completely." Eleanor opened her mouth to protest, to remind him that she had never said those cruel words, but Frederick held up his hand and she fell silent, because she saw that he needed to finish, needed to lance this wound that had festered for 8 long years. "I tried to forget you," he continued, his hands gripping the arms of her father's worn chair just as they had the night before. "I threw myself into every distraction a wealthy duke might find, but I could not. And when my mother paraded eligible young ladies before me season after season, I compared every one of them to you and found them all wanting, and eventually she stopped trying, and I resigned myself to a life without love, without children, without any of the warmth that I see now in this modest cottage. And I told myself it was enough." The whispers began, as all village whispers do. Softly at first, exchanged behind gloved hands and over teacups in parlours where Eleanor had once been welcomed as a respectable widow and accomplished music teacher. But by early November 1815, the whispers had grown into something louder and more dangerous, a current of speculation that followed Eleanor through the narrow streets of Hartwell and made her students' mothers exchange meaningful glances when she arrived for lessons, and Charlotte reported with barely contained fury that she had overheard Mrs. Pemberton at the haberdashery declaring that she had always known there was something not quite right about Mrs. Ashworth and that mysterious widow story. "And did you notice how the boy has those unusual grey eyes, just like the Duke, who has been calling at her cottage every single day for weeks now, and really what respectable widow entertains a gentleman alone in her home at all hours?" And Charlotte had wanted to march right over and give the old gossip a piece of her mind, but Eleanor had begged her not to, because confrontation would only fan the flames higher, and besides, what could Charlotte say that would not confirm the very suspicions the village had begun to nurture? Frederick noticed the change when he accompanied Eleanor and Tommy to the village market on a crisp November morning, and saw how the shopkeepers who had once greeted Eleanor with warm smiles now served her with tight lips and averted eyes. How mothers pulled their children closer when Tommy ran past, laughing. How conversations stopped abruptly when they approached and resumed in urgent murmurs after they passed, and his jaw tightened with a fury that Eleanor recognized from their confrontation weeks ago, though now it was directed outward at these small-minded people who dared to judge her after everything she had survived. "Let me announce our engagement," he said that afternoon, as they walked the lane behind her cottage, with Tommy running ahead to chase the last stubborn leaves that clung to the hedgerows. "Let me put an end to this gossip by making you the Duchess of Ravenscroft and giving Tommy his rightful name." And Eleanor felt her heart lurch at the word engagement, because she had not yet given him an answer to his pragmatic proposal, and some foolish part of her had begun to hope that when she did accept, it would be for reasons that had nothing to do with pragmatism at all. "The village assembly is in 3 days," she said quietly, watching Tommy's dark hair catch the weak November sunlight, "and if we appear there together, the gossip will only grow worse unless we have something definitive to announce." And Frederick stopped walking and turned to face her, with those silver-grey eyes that their son had inherited, and that had haunted her dreams for 8 long years, and she saw in them something that looked remarkably like hope. "Then give me your answer, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and rough, "and let me protect you and our son the way I should have protected you 8 years ago when my mother stole our future." And Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but Tommy came racing back, demanding to show them a particularly magnificent red leaf. And the moment passed, though the question hung between them like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Eleanor spent the 2 days before the assembly in a state of quiet turmoil that she hid from Tommy with practiced maternal skill, but that Charlotte saw through immediately when she arrived on the morning of the assembly to help Eleanor dress and found her friend standing before her modest wardrobe, with tears streaming silently down her cheeks, and Charlotte gathered her into an embrace and let her weep without asking questions, because Charlotte understood that this was not simply about village dance, but about 8 years of shame and survival, and the terrifying precipice of hope that Eleanor now stood upon. And when the tears had passed, and Eleanor had washed her face and steadied her breathing, Charlotte helped her into the dove-grey gown she had worn to that fateful assembly. 6 weeks ago, when Frederick had walked back into her life and shattered the careful peace she had constructed. And as Charlotte fastened the buttons, Eleanor stared at her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand and wondered if the woman who looked back at her was brave enough to walk into that assembly hall on the arm of a duke and face down the whispers and stares of people who had been her neighbors for 7 years. People who had welcomed her when she arrived pregnant and alone, with a story about a dead husband that everyone had been too polite to question. People who had sent their daughters to learn piano from her and invited her to tea and treated her as one of their own, until a wealthy stranger began calling at her cottage, and suddenly all that neighborly warmth had curdled into suspicion and judgment. Frederick arrived at precisely 7 in the evening in his finest coat of dark blue superfine with a silver waistcoat that matched his eyes, and Eleanor felt her breath catch when she saw him standing in her doorway with Tommy bouncing excitedly at his side, because their son had begged to attend the assembly this time, and Frederick had promised to dance with him even though Tommy protested that boys did not dance, and Frederick had laughed and said that dukes did whatever they pleased, and if he wanted to dance with his son then he would, and that casual acknowledgement of their relationship had made Eleanor's heart swell with something that felt dangerously like love. The walk to the assembly hall took only 10 minutes, but it felt like a march to the gallows as Eleanor clung to Frederick's arm and Tommy skipped ahead and the curtains in cottage windows twitched as they passed, and she knew that by tomorrow morning the entire village would know that the mysterious Mrs. Ashworth had arrived at the assembly on the arm of the Duke of Ravenscroft, with a child whose grey eyes and dark hair suddenly made perfect sense, and she wanted to turn back, wanted to flee to the safety of her cottage and bar the door against the world, but Frederick's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, and he leaned close and murmured, "You have survived far worse than gossip, my darling, and tonight we will give them something new to talk about." And when they reached the assembly hall doors, he paused and looked down at her with those silver-grey eyes that had haunted her dreams for 8 years, and said, "I love you, Eleanor, and I should have said it weeks ago, but I was afraid, and I am not afraid anymore." And before she could respond, he pushed open the doors and led her into the light. The assembly hall fell silent as Frederick led Eleanor through the doors, with Tommy dancing at their heels, and she felt every eye in the room turn toward them like flowers following the sun, felt the weight of 7 years of carefully constructed respectability crumbling under the scrutiny of neighbors who had once called her friend and now looked at her as though she were a stranger. And Mrs. Pemberton's mouth fell open in an expression that would have been comical if Eleanor had not been fighting the urge to flee back into the darkness, but Frederick's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, and his whispered declaration of love still rang in her ears like church bells announcing something sacred, something she had never dared to hope for through all the long years of survival and shame and fierce maternal love. The musicians had stopped playing, and the dancers had frozen mid-step, and Tommy tugged at Frederick's coat, asking why everyone was staring, and Frederick smiled down at his son with such open affection that Eleanor heard gasps ripple through the crowd, and then Frederick raised his voice in that commanding tone that spoke of generations of authority, and said, "I believe you all know Mrs. Ashworth, who has graced your village with her presence these 7 years, and taught your daughters to play the pianoforte with such skill. And I am here tonight to introduce myself properly as Frederick Sinclair, Duke of Ravenscroft, and to announce that Mrs. Ashworth has done me the very great honor of accepting my proposal of marriage." And Eleanor felt her breath catch, because she had not actually said yes, but his eyes met hers with a question in them, and she found herself nodding, found herself saying yes loud enough for the silent room to hear, and the word tasted like freedom on her lips. The silence stretched for one more heartbeat before Charlotte burst into applause from somewhere near the refreshment table, and the spell broke, and suddenly people were crowding forward offering congratulations with varying degrees of sincerity. And Mrs. Pemberton was simpering about how she had always known Mrs. Ashworth was quality, and the vicar was pumping Frederick's hand and asking about wedding dates, and Tommy was asking if this meant his father would live with them forever, and Frederick laughed and swept his son up into his arms and said yes, and Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, though she could not have said whether they were tears of joy or relief or grief for all the years they had lost, or simply the overwhelming release of finally being allowed to stop pretending. Frederick led her onto the dance floor as the musicians hastily struck up a waltz, and she stepped into his arms as naturally as breathing, as though 8 years had not passed since they last danced together at a London ball when she was young and hopeful and had no idea of the heartbreak that awaited her, and he held her close enough to be improper, and whispered against her hair, "I should have said those words weeks ago. I should have told you every day since I found you again, that I never stopped loving you." And Eleanor lifted her face to his and said, "Then tell me now," and he did. The days following the assembly passed in a golden haze of disbelief and joy that Eleanor hardly dared trust, for she had spent so many years expecting disappointment that happiness felt like a garment borrowed from someone else that might be reclaimed at any moment. But Frederick remained steadfastly present, arriving each morning at her cottage with gifts for Tommy, and soft looks for her that made her heart flutter, like the girl she had been at 20 before the world had taught her that love was a luxury she could not afford. And the village that had whispered about her for weeks now buzzed with a different sort of gossip, as news of the Duke's proposal spread from the assembly hall to every cottage and shop in Hartwell. And suddenly Eleanor found herself transformed in the eyes of her neighbours from a woman of questionable virtue to a romantic heroine whose tragic secret love affair with a duke had finally been rewarded with the happy ending she deserved. And Mrs. Pemberton, who had cut her dead in the street just 3 days ago, now appeared at her door with a basket of preserves and effusive congratulations that Eleanor accepted with a graciousness that cost her more than she would ever admit. Frederick threw himself into wedding preparations with the same determination he brought to everything, sending for his solicitors from London to draw up settlements that would protect Eleanor and Tommy, regardless of what the future held. And when Eleanor tried to protest that she needed nothing from him but his presence, he had taken her hands and looked at her with those silver-grey eyes and said that she had spent 8 years providing for their son alone. And now it was his turn to provide for them both, and the fierceness in his voice had made her cry, because no one had ever fought for her before, not her weak father who had sold her for £500, not the cousin who had taken her in with grudging charity, not anyone until this man who had loved her once and lost her and found her again against all odds. Tommy blossomed under his father's attention in ways that made Eleanor's heart ache with gratitude and regret, for she saw now how much her son had needed a father's presence, even as she had convinced herself that her love alone was enough, and Frederick seemed equally transformed by fatherhood, the cold cynicism that had armored him for 8 years melting away whenever Tommy demanded his attention, or asked his endless questions, or simply reached for his hand during their walks through the autumn countryside. Charlotte visited daily, ostensibly to help with wedding plans, but really to marvel at the change in her friend. And one afternoon, As they sat together while Frederick and Tommy explored the garden, Charlotte said quietly, "I have never seen you smile like this, not in all the 7 years I have known you," and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she admitted that she had forgotten she could smile like this, had forgotten that joy was something she was allowed to feel. And Charlotte embraced her and whispered that she deserved every happiness, and Eleanor finally believed it. The wedding preparations consumed the following weeks with a flurry of activity that Eleanor found both overwhelming and strangely healing. For each decision made and each plan set into motion felt like another brick in the foundation of the new life she was building with Frederick and Tommy, a life she had never dared to imagine during all those years of quiet survival in her cottage with the blue door. And Frederick insisted on involving her in every choice, from the flowers that would fill the church to the menu for the wedding breakfast, treating her opinions as though they mattered, as though she were already his duchess, rather than the disgraced woman the village had whispered about for 7 long years. And this careful consideration of her wishes touched Eleanor more deeply than any grand gesture could have done, because it spoke of respect as well as love, of partnership rather than mere possession. The banns were read in the village church on 3 successive Sundays, and each time Eleanor sat in her usual pew with Tommy beside her and Frederick in the Ravenscroft family box that had stood empty for generations, and she heard the vicar pronounce their names together and felt the curious eyes of every neighbour upon her, and no longer cared what they thought, because she had Frederick's love and Tommy's happiness and Charlotte's loyal friendship, and these were treasures beyond any price that gossip could exact. Frederick's solicitors arrived from London with documents that made Eleanor's head spin, settlements and provisions and legal protections that would ensure she and Tommy would never know want regardless of what the future held. And when she tried to protest that she needed nothing but his presence, Frederick had silenced her with a kiss and said that he had failed to protect her once and would spend the rest of his life making certain she never felt vulnerable again, and Eleanor had wept against his chest because no one had ever fought for her security with such fierce determination. Tommy talked of nothing but the wedding, asking endless questions about whether he would have new clothes and whether there would be cake, and whether his father would truly live with them forever, and Frederick answered each query with patient affection that made Eleanor's heart swell with gratitude for this man who had lost 7 years of his son's life and was determined to be present for every moment remaining. And she watched them together in the garden, or bent over Tommy's collection of treasures, or walking hand in hand through the autumn lanes, and she thought that perhaps the years of suffering had been worth enduring if they had led to this, to a family forged not in the easy circumstances of youth, but in the harder crucible of loss and reunion, and forgiveness. Charlotte helped Eleanor choose fabric for her wedding gown, a deep cream silk that would be made up by the finest dressmaker in Exeter, and as they pored over fashion plates together, Charlotte said that she had never seen Eleanor look so beautiful, and Eleanor realized it was true, that love had transformed her from the careworn widow she had been into someone who glowed with hope and happiness. The wedding day dawned bright and cold in late November, the kind of crystalline winter morning that seemed designed by Providence to bless new beginnings. And Eleanor woke in her cottage with the blue door for the last time, as Mrs. Ashworth, for by evening she would be the Duchess of Ravenscroft, a title that still felt like a garment made for someone else, even as Charlotte helped her into the cream silk gown that transformed her into someone she barely recognized in the small mirror that had witnessed so many years of quiet survival. Tommy was beside himself with excitement, dressed in a new suit that Frederick had ordered from London, his dark hair slicked back and his silver-grey eyes shining with a joy that made Eleanor's heart ache with gratitude for this second chance she had never dared to hope for. And when Frederick arrived at the church in his finest coat with his cravat perfectly tied and his own grey eyes bright with emotion, she felt the last of her doubts dissolve like morning frost beneath the winter sun. The village church was filled with neighbours who had whispered about her for 7 years, and now watched with curious eyes as the disgraced widow became a duchess. But Eleanor no longer cared about their opinions, because she had Frederick's hand steady and warm around hers as they spoke their vows, and she had Tommy standing proudly beside his father as witness to the union that should have happened 8 years ago before Lady Agatha's cruelty had torn them apart. The vicar's voice seemed to come from very far away, as Eleanor promised to love and honor this man who had searched for her for months after she disappeared, who had refused to marry anyone else, who had looked at their son and seen himself reflected back and had wept with the grief of lost years, even as he vowed to be present for every moment remaining. And when Frederick slipped the ring onto her finger, she felt something shift in her chest, some final barrier crumbling that she had built so carefully during all those years of protecting herself and Tommy from a world that had shown her little kindness. Frederick kissed her in the church before God and the assembled villagers, and Charlotte, who wept openly, and Tommy, who giggled. And the kiss tasted of promises kept and second chances and a future that stretched before them like an unwritten page waiting to be filled with joy rather than sorrow. The wedding breakfast was held at the inn where Frederick had lodged during his courtship, and the village worthies who had cut Eleanor in the street now raised glasses to her. Health, with smiles that she accepted with the same graciousness she had shown Mrs. Pemberton's sudden friendship, for she understood now that society's approval was as changeable as the weather, and far less reliable than the love of the man who sat beside her, and the child who called them both his own. The carriage that carried them away from the village church bore the Ravenscroft crest upon its doors, and Eleanor watched through the window as the cottage with the blue door grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared around a bend in the lane, and she felt Tommy press closer to her side, while Frederick's hand found hers in the space between them, and she thought of all the mornings she had stood at that blue door, watching the sun rise over Devon, and wondering if she would spend the rest of her life in quiet obscurity, with only her son and her music, and her memories of a love that had burned too bright and too brief. The journey to Ravenscroft House would take 3 days, and Frederick had arranged for them to stop at comfortable inns along the way, treating Eleanor with a tender solicitude that made her heart ache with the knowledge that this was what their life might have been from the beginning. If Lady Agatha had not torn them apart with her lies and her money and her cold certainty that a gentleman's daughter of modest means was unworthy of her son. Tommy chattered endlessly about the horses and the changing countryside and the great house he would soon call home, and Frederick answered each question with the patience of a man who was still learning how to be a father, but who approached the task with the same determination he brought to everything else. And Eleanor watched them together, and felt the last vestiges of her bitterness dissolve like morning mist beneath the pale November sun. On the second night of their journey, after Tommy had fallen asleep in the adjoining room of the inn where they stayed, Frederick took Eleanor's hands in his and told her that he had written to his solicitors about the legal process that would legitimize Tommy as his heir, and that by spring their son would bear the name Sinclair and the title that was his birthright, and Eleanor wept against his shoulder because she had spent 7 years protecting Tommy from the stigma of illegitimacy, and now that burden was being lifted by the very man she had believed had abandoned them both. Frederick held her while she cried and whispered promises against her hair, promises of love and protection and a future that stretched before them like an unwritten page, and Eleanor thought of the girl she had been at 20, so naive and hopeful in her white muslin gown with blue ribbons, and she understood now that the woman she had become through years of struggle and survival was stronger and wiser and more capable of appreciating the gift of this second chance. The final day of their journey dawned grey and cold, and as the carriage crested the last hill, Eleanor saw Ravenscroft House, for the first time, a magnificent edifice of golden stone that seemed to glow even beneath the overcast sky. And Tommy pressed his face to the window and gasped with wonder, while Frederick watched Eleanor's reaction with anxious eyes, and she squeezed his hand and smiled and said that it was beautiful, and she meant not just the house, but everything it represented, the life they would build together, the family they had become, the love that had survived 8 years of separation and emerged stronger for the breaking. The great oak doors of Ravenscroft House swung open as the carriage rolled to a stop, and Eleanor saw a line of servants assembled on the steps despite the grey November cold, footmen in immaculate livery and maids in crisp white caps, and a butler whose dignified bearing spoke of decades of service to the Sinclair family. And she understood in that moment that her life had changed irrevocably, that she was no longer the music teacher in the cottage with the blue door, but the Duchess of Ravenscroft, mistress of this magnificent estate that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Frederick helped her down from the carriage with tender care, his hand warm and steady beneath her elbow, and then he lifted Tommy down, and the boy stood staring up at the golden stone facade with his mouth open in wonder, his silver-grey eyes reflecting the pale light of the winter sky, and Eleanor felt her heart swell with a fierce, protective love for this child who had been born in shame and secrecy and was now the legitimate heir to all of this grandeur. The butler, whose name was Pemberton, welcomed them with a bow so deep and respectful that Eleanor nearly laughed at the absurdity of being treated with such deference after 7 years of being cut by village matrons and whispered about in shops. But she maintained her composure and inclined her head graciously, as Frederick had coached her during the journey, playing the role of Duchess even as she felt like an impostor in a borrowed life. The entrance hall took her breath away, soaring ceilings painted with scenes of classical mythology and marble floors that gleamed in the light of 100 candles. And Tommy tugged at her hand and pointed upward at a painted figure of Apollo driving his chariot across a cerulean sky. And Frederick smiled at his son's wonder with an expression of such pure joy that Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. The housekeeper, Mrs. Crawford, a stout woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, led them on a tour of the family apartments, while servants scurried ahead to light fires and prepare rooms. And Eleanor tried to memorize the endless corridors and staircases, even as she knew it would take months to learn her way around this labyrinth of elegance and history. Tommy's room was next to theirs, a bright chamber with windows overlooking the gardens, and a bed so large he could have shared it with 3 other boys his size, and he immediately began exploring every corner, while Frederick watched with the same anxious attention he had shown since learning of his son's existence, as if he feared Tommy might disappear if he looked away for even a moment. That night, after Tommy had been tucked into his enormous bed by a nursemaid who clearly adored him already, Eleanor stood at the window of the Duchess's chambers and looked out over the moonlit grounds of Ravenscroft, and Frederick came to stand behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist and pressed his lips to her hair, and she leaned back against him and felt for the first time that she had come home. The days that followed their arrival at Ravenscroft House passed in a blur of new faces and unfamiliar rituals, and Eleanor found herself learning the intricate dance of being a duchess, while Tommy explored every corner of his new home with the fearless curiosity that had always been his nature. And Frederick watched them both with an expression of such tender wonder that Eleanor sometimes had to look away to keep from weeping at the thought of all the years they had lost to his mother's cruel machinations. The staff had clearly been instructed to treat her with the utmost respect, and Mrs. Crawford became her ally in navigating the complex hierarchy of the household, explaining which servants reported to whom and how the great house functioned as smoothly as a well-wound clock. And Eleanor listened and learned and slowly began to feel less like an impostor and more like the mistress she had become. Tommy adapted with the resilience of childhood, making friends with the stable boys and charming the kitchen maids and following his father around the estate with questions tumbling from his lips faster than Frederick could answer them, and Eleanor watched their bond deepen with each passing day and felt her heart healing in ways she had not known it needed. One afternoon, as she sat in the morning room that was now hers, practicing on a pianoforte far finer than any she had ever touched, Frederick appeared in the doorway and stood listening until she finished the piece, and then he crossed the room and sat beside her on the bench, and told her that he had received word from his solicitors that the legal documents legitimizing Tommy as his heir would be ready for signing before Christmas, and Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth and let the tears fall because her son would never again be whispered about or looked down upon or made to feel less than any other child. Frederick gathered her into his arms and held her while she cried, and she felt the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, and knew that this was real, that after 8 years of struggle and loneliness and fierce maternal love, she had finally found the home she had dreamed of in those dark nights in the cottage with the blue door. That evening, as they dressed for dinner in their adjoining chambers, Frederick came to her with a velvet box in his hands and opened it to reveal a necklace of sapphires and diamonds that had belonged to his grandmother, and he fastened it around her throat and met her eyes in the mirror and said that he wanted her to have something beautiful to mark this new beginning, and Eleanor touched the cool stones against her skin and thought of Lady Agatha's sapphire necklace and felt a fierce satisfaction that she had won, that love had triumphed over cruelty, that the woman who had tried to destroy her had failed utterly and completely. And when Frederick pressed his lips to her bare shoulder, she turned in his arms and kissed him with all the passion she had buried for 8 long years. The Christmas season arrived at Ravenscroft House with all the grandeur that centuries of tradition demanded, and Eleanor found herself swept up in preparations that would have seemed impossible just months ago when she had been counting every penny to ensure Tommy had a warm coat for winter, and now she was consulting with Mrs. Crawford about menus for a feast that would feed 50 guests and discussing with the head gardener which hothouse flowers should adorn the great hall, and sometimes she had to stop and press her hand to her heart to remind herself that this was real, that she was truly the Duchess of Ravenscroft, and not dreaming in her narrow bed in the cottage with the blue door. Tommy had thrown himself into the festive preparations with all the enthusiasm of a child who had never known such abundance, helping the footman carry in armloads of holly and ivy and standing on tiptoe to watch the cook prepare mince pies and asking his father 1,000 questions about the massive Yule log that would be dragged into the great fireplace on Christmas Eve. And Frederick indulged every curiosity with a patience that still surprised Eleanor, though she was learning that beneath his cold exterior beat a heart capable of tremendous tenderness. Charlotte arrived from Devon 3 days before Christmas, her red hair bright against her travelling cloak and her face alight with wonder as she took in the magnificence of Eleanor's new home, and the 2 women embraced in the entrance hall while Frederick looked on with an expression of warm approval, for he understood now how much Charlotte had done to protect his son during the years of his ignorance, and he had insisted she be treated as honoured family. On Christmas morning, Tommy woke before dawn and burst into his parents' chamber with cries of excitement, and Frederick lifted the boy onto their bed where he bounced between them, pointing out the frost patterns on the windows and begging to go downstairs to see what Father Christmas had brought. And Eleanor lay there watching her son and his father with their matching silver-grey eyes and dark hair, and felt a joy so profound it seemed impossible that her heart could contain it. The gifts were extravagant beyond anything Tommy had ever imagined. A rocking horse carved from dark wood, with a real leather saddle and a set of tin soldiers and books, with coloured illustrations and warm clothes of the finest quality, and he moved from one treasure to the next, with exclamations of delight, while Frederick watched with tears in his eyes that he did not bother to hide. Later, when the great feast had been consumed, and the tenants had come to receive their Christmas boxes, and the carolers had sung in the great hall, Eleanor stood at the window of the drawing-room, watching the snow fall softly over the grounds of Ravenscroft, and felt Frederick come to stand beside her, and he took her hand and raised it to his lips, and told her that this was the first Christmas in 8 years that had felt like anything other than an empty performance, and she turned into his arms and kissed him deeply, while their son played with his new soldiers by the fire, and Charlotte dozed contentedly in a chair, and Eleanor knew that she had finally found the family she had always dreamed of. The new year of 1816 dawned bright and cold over Ravenscroft House, and Eleanor stood at the window of her private sitting-room, watching the frost glitter on the grounds, and thinking of how different this January was from all the Januaries that had come before, those bleak months in the cottage when she had counted every coin and worried about coal and prayed that her music students would not cancel their lessons due to weather, and now she was warm and safe and loved in a house grander than anything she had ever imagined, with a husband who adored her and a son who flourished more with each passing day. Frederick had thrown himself into fatherhood with an intensity that sometimes made Eleanor weep with gratitude, and sometimes made her laugh at his earnest attempts to compress 7 years of missed experiences into every single day, and Tommy basked in his attention like a flower turning toward the sun, growing more confident and more joyful with each week that passed in his new home. The legal documents had been signed before the new year, and Thomas Frederick Sinclair was now officially recognized as the legitimate son and heir of the Duke of Ravenscroft, and Eleanor had watched Frederick's hand tremble as he signed his name, and understood that this moment meant as much to him as it did to her. Perhaps more, because he had spent 8 years in ignorance while she had at least had the joy of raising their son. Charlotte had returned to Devon after Twelfth Night, with promises to visit often and tearful embraces that left both women laughing at their own sentimentality, and Eleanor had pressed a generous bank draft into her friend's hands despite her protests, insisting that Charlotte accept this gift for all the years of faithful friendship and protection she had provided when Eleanor had nothing to give in return. The great house that had seemed so intimidating at first was slowly becoming home, and Eleanor found her place in its rhythms, consulting with the housekeeper about menus and the steward about tenant concerns and the gardener about plans for spring planting, and Frederick watched her grow into her role with an expression of such pride that she sometimes had to look away to keep from blushing. At night, in the grand ducal bedchamber they now shared, Frederick held her close and whispered of his plans for their future, of the improvements he would make to the estate for Tommy to inherit, of the siblings he hoped they might give their son, of the life they would build together now that they had finally found their way back to each other. And Eleanor listened and responded and let herself dream of all the years that stretched ahead of them, years that would hold joy and sorrow and ordinary days and extraordinary moments, but that would never again hold loneliness or shame or the bitter ache of love lost. She had survived 8 years of struggle through her own strength and determination, and now she would thrive in this new life, not because of the title or the wealth or the grand house, but because she had found again the man she had never stopped loving, and had given their son the father he deserved. The spring of 1816 brought warmth and new growth to Ravenscroft, and Eleanor watched the gardens burst into bloom with a heart that felt equally renewed. For the months since her marriage had transformed her in ways she could never have anticipated, when she had stood trembling in that village assembly hall and seen Frederick's silver-grey eyes meet hers across the crowded room. Tommy had grown 2 inches since Christmas, and had lost his first tooth, and had begun lessons with a tutor Frederick had carefully selected, a kind young man who recognized the boy's quick mind and nurtured it with patience and enthusiasm, and Eleanor sometimes paused outside the schoolroom door just to listen to her son's eager questions and the tutor's thoughtful answers, and marvel at how different this was from the uncertain education she had cobbled together in Devon with borrowed books and her own limited knowledge. Frederick had proven himself a devoted father in ways that still surprised her, rising early to breakfast with Tommy before the boys' lessons, spending afternoons teaching him to ride properly on a gentle mare chosen specifically for a child's first horse, reading to him in the evenings by the fire, while Eleanor played soft melodies on the magnificent piano that now stood in the music room where she gave lessons to no one because she no longer needed to work for her living. The intimacy between Eleanor and Frederick had deepened through the winter months, moving from the careful tenderness of their wedding night to something richer and more passionate, and she had learned that the cold duke the world saw was merely armor protecting a heart capable of profound love and devastating vulnerability. And she had let him see her own heart in return, the fears and hopes and dreams she had guarded so carefully through all the lonely years. In April, Eleanor began to suspect what the subtle changes in her body might mean, and she waited until she was certain before telling Frederick one evening as they sat together in their private sitting room, and she would never forget the way his face transformed from confusion to wonder to a joy so intense it brought tears to his eyes, and he had knelt before her chair and pressed his face to her still flat stomach, and whispered promises to the child growing within her, promises that he would be present for every moment of this life, that he would never again miss the miracle of watching his child come into the world. Tommy was told he would be a brother by summer's end, and his excitement was boundless, and he spent weeks debating whether he wanted a brother to play soldiers with or a sister to protect, and finally decided that either would be acceptable as long as the baby understood that he, Tommy, was the eldest and therefore in charge of important matters like which games to play and which biscuits to choose from the tea tray.